All right, everybody. Today we're talking about Kate Chopin. Following our discussion last time about Ambrose Bierce and uh, Booker T. Washington, we're moving on to Kate Chopin, uh, relatively aristocratic, more like Henry James than our previous authors. Her early upbringing, our textbook tells us, page 537. Her father was an Irish immigrant. Her mother is from an quote old St. Louis Creole family, so she has these influences on her early upbringing of the French Creole of St. Louis and the Irish of her father. The textbook tells us that at least in her early years, French was the language spoken at home. And also, finally, that the traditions in her home were French, Southern, Catholic, and aristocratic. So you can imagine with French being spoken at home and with the Irish Catholic from her father, the French, Southern French from her mother's side, uh, and especially with in a family of means of the aristocratic variety, um, that I don't know what that means except that it's rather unique and it influences her writing quite a lot. And on page 538, we have a description of her writing style and her philosophy about writing, and also a little bit about her family life, which we might think is interesting. For years, her energies were given over to her family, but after her husband's death, she returned with her 6 children to St. Louis. And so, with 6 children and also the death of her husband, um, well, the death of her husband we see is a similarity to the story of an hour, in which Louise Mallard's, the character's husband, dies, or she thinks he dies, and in the end, we find out that's not the case. Um, so we can see a little bit of a Louise Mallard analogy between Louise and the author. But as far as her 6 children are concerned, devoting her early years to those children, to the family, she didn't have a lot of time for writing. But then we see our textbook tells us that writing came easy to Chopin when she had an idea for a story. She sat down and wrote it, composing on a lapboard while seated in the family living room and likely surrounded in the living room by her children, 6 children. And so she's sitting and writing with presumably no help but the help, I suppose, coming from an aristocracy. I suppose it's um, likely that she had some servants or something to help her with the kids, but even still, it's quite significant. I myself can uh, relate in that I have 2 children and I can't imagine getting anything done. Uh, Although sometimes I have to, it's not quality work in the living room surrounded by only my 2 children and a single widowed mother of 6 children writing in the living room is quite surprising to me, and perhaps you too, if you also have children right now and you are in your living room listening to a lecture, taking your online course in American literature with your children at your side, trying to focus. I'm sure that we can relate to her at least a little. Uh, and also, as far as her writing philosophy is concerned, it's a realistic one. Perhaps you've heard of a writing technique called the stream of consciousness. It's a writing style that begins to come to I guess it begins to become manifest in this time period, perhaps beginning with Kate Chopin and continued on through the authors that we'll study in the future, perhaps William Carlos Williams and um, oh, Carl Sandburg and a little bit of T.S. Eliot and the poets, the more modern poets that maybe we're more familiar with. Stream of consciousness became an important technique for the modern writers. And we see a lot of that here in her own writing philosophy. Often she completed a story on the same day that she had begun it, justifying her practice by her belief in the value of spontaneity. And so we see her work as quality work. The Story of an Hour is a well-written story with lots of continuity and rich character development in very brief sentences. And so to often complete a story the day that you had begun it is a little bit maybe unusual. We all have experience writing, and I think most of us know that to complete something on the same day that you begin it is quite significant. And then justifying your practice, belief in spontaneity. The realists, their value, the thing that they value is truth, representing the thing as it is, representing experience as it is, and therefore not romanticizing it as some glorious, outstanding, extraordinary feat, but instead representing the everyday experience of everyday common kinds of people. And so therefore, the spontaneity under Chopin's philosophy is that adherence to the truth of the moment in the spontaneous creation of a piece of literature. And she goes on to explain that I am completely at the mercy of unconscious selection. This is that stream of consciousness, unconscious selection. To such an extent, it is this true that what is called the polishing up process, or what we might call the revision process, this process of revising her work, she says, has always proved disastrous to my work, and I avoid it, preferring the integrity of crudities and artificiality to artificiality. So she sees that the revision process makes a text more artificial, therefore more fake. And to be a true realist, she argues that her work should be devoted to this spontaneous, unconscious selection, and then unrevised to represent the truth of the moment in which she wrote it. And so in that way, Kate Chopin is perhaps one of the more devoted realists that we've studied so far. And also, let's think about her timing here too, and that who she's influenced by. Whitman is her strongest influence. Our authors tell us that she was distanced from her contemporary writers like Howells and Sarah Orne Jewett and Freeman. Distance from these contemporary authors of her time. Instead, she kept her Whitman always at hand at a time when he was considered scarcely respectable by large numbers of readers. So she was reading Whitman when no one else was. Remember, Whitman was poor all his life and got no literary recognition until after his death. But Kate Chopin seemed to understand Whitman's value to the movement in literature going on at the time. And so now we move on to the story, the actual story, the story of an hour. And I think we're to understand that this story takes place in the time span of an hour. And to begin with a brief summary of the story, we have Louise Mallard, Mrs. Mallard, uh, and her sister Josephine. And Josephine tells her that her husband has died, or is it her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her, uh, and revealed that Brentley Mallard, Louise's husband, had died on some train accident. He was killed. And Louise Mallard, in this hour, the story of an hour, is dealing with the news of her husband's death. And we also know that Louise Mallard has a bit of heart trouble, and so we had to break the news to her very gently. And I don't know, speaking of Henry James and Kate Chopin as being aristocrats, another similarity that Henry James and her share is um, the psychological realism, the realism of the human mind. That as their characters move and um, make decisions, the narrator spends a lot of time uh, explaining the thought process, the feelings and emotions of the character from within. So this psychological or emotional kind of realism that we all kind of feel and share. And so that's what the story of an hour is as Louise Mallard is consciously or unconsciously dealing with and feeling the emotions of her husband's death. And so she goes up to her room upstairs to just be privately. And as the image here on the screen shows, her sitting in a chair, this is what Louise Mallard does up in her room. Sits in her very aristocratically set, looks like there's a hall tree there and a very florally decorated wooden chair, and her gown is so um, high, uh, you know, classy and whatnot. So anyway, she sits up in her room. Louise Mallard sits up in her room and stares out the window and contemplates her life now that her husband has died. And so, in the end of the story, though, she has recovered from the thought in an hour. She's recovered from the news of her husband's death. She's gone through all these stages of grief. Some scholars have argued about the stages of grief that occur in the story. But once she recovers, she comes out of the room and begins to go downstairs. And, well, who comes through the door but her husband? And with her heart trouble, uh, the and the and her newfound freedom, the story argues, and the loss of it, now that her husband is actually not dead but alive, uh, creates a heart spasm, I suppose, and she dies in the end because her husband is actually alive, and they couldn't they yeah. So when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, em dash of joy that kills, and this is the final line of the story on page 540. Uh, and so the first thing I have on our list to talk about for the story is feminism. Uh, this story, and Kate Chopin is considered one of the early American feminist writers. And of course, the story can be read in a way that sympathizes with the plight of the woman as stationed in a home without any responsibilities. Suffrage occurs in the mid 1900s, so this is the early kind of creation of that social movement, in which she creates a story in which a woman uh, is satisfied within an hour. I don't know if you think that's fast or not. To the movement that she goes through in her emotions, but regardless, uh, she comes to realize that she's now free, which is to suggest that perhaps before her husband died, she was not free, and that his husband's death, brings freedom. Uh, and so she's free, 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 body and soul free. And her death in the end, while the story, uh, well, we can talk about that in a minute, but so anyway, there you have it, a bit of the feminist reading of the story. Now, how about just some of the symbolic things that are in the story? Uh, One thing that, and I should make a PowerPoint slide about this, where we talk about nature symbols and seasonal symbols, and when people say that they're in a certain season of life, they what they mean is something about spring time. Okay, so springtime we see as a symbol of life. It's a time of new, of rebirth, of renaissance of the vegetation across the land. We see in springtime the birds are singing, the bees are buzzing and pollinating, and the flowers are blooming, and the grass is growing, and the rains of spring have brought a rejuvenation to the landscape. And so springtime symbolizes times in our life when we are revived, when we're renewed, when we become alive, when we're young. In the springtime of my life, I was, a young boy learning about being a human. And now that I'm middle aged, 30 or so, uh, well, I mean, I'm 34. I do know how old I am. Now that I'm 34, I'd say I'm more in a summertime of my life, right? That time after spring when all the growth is kind of like peaked and everything is just very large and green. The landscape is in its kind of prime, right? Not that I'm in my prime, I guess I am. But in the summertime of our lives, we are right in that kind of thing, and then which is we don't see a lot of summer as symbolism in literature because perhaps writers don't write a lot about um, people in their prime. Perhaps that's a romantic kind of idea to write about people who are in their prime. So anyway, moving on to fall is when decay starts to happen, right? When people are later in their lives. And the leaves start to brown and fall off the trees, and death is in the near future for trees and for us humans. Uh, and so we can see it coming, but we're aging and um, well, yeah. So there's fall, symbolizing a time in a person's life, and then of course winter is that death and decay and the cold and the icy and the gray landscapes. That's winter, and in literature, winter is that symbolic time of a bleak, gray, dead landscape. Okay, so now that we've qualified that, on page 539, when she stood. Okay, so this is the fourth paragraph. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair, like the one we see on the slide. Uh, Roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. In the next paragraph, she says, she could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all a quiver with the new spring life. Okay, and so she goes up in this room and sits down and sinks in this armchair and stares out the window. And outside, she sees springtime, a symbol of new life. And it is a new time in her life, right? It's a rejuvenation as she comes to see it, of her freedom now that her husband is dead, and she comes to that. So springtime of the in the story reminds us of that life, and just going on with that symbolism there. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. So, this springtime symbolism could be that symbol of her rebirth in her life now that she's not married anymore but widowed. Another thing I'd like to talk about with this story is technology. Uh, One scholar has written a short review of this story and its relevance to the technological developments of the telegraph and the train. Commuters at this time to work, like her husband, Mr. Mallard, what's his name? Do we know it? Brentley, that's right. Brentley Mallard's going to work on a train. And that made the train itself made commuting fast, very easy, and public transportation. And also the news of his death travels via telegram, which is also very fast, right? And so those two technologies, the speed of those technologies in the story at the time, new technologies, are relevant to the story in that, I guess for the plot, they're the ones that, because the telegram delivers the message before Brentley gets home, and the message is a false message, obviously. There's not the message, you could say, comes too quickly, and the technology moves too quickly, and that these technologies and their speed outrunning the pace of other technologies and so on and so forth represent in our own lives a similar kind of thing, in that some would argue that our own technologies move too fast, right? And it's probably not going to be an equivalent situation where you'll have a person that's been reported dead and then they turn up to be alive. But in our own lives, when we, I don't know, when we email someone or when we text someone, uh, well, I don't know what to say about that except that many argue that the world's just moving too fast these days, right? Like the old man that says, "Get off my lawn." I feel like the kind of curmudgeon-y old guy who's like, "I don't like the newfangled technology and all that stuff." But there are arguments to be made for technological developments that maybe aren't helping us, but in fact are overcomplicating and taking the place of physical communication that we need to have. I mean, this is an online lecture, by God. So it's taking the place of our in-class conversation as it is. So I mean, what things are lacking here in this space, in this communication. And then finally, I'd like to talk about a little bit of irony in the story about joy and the joy that kills. At the end of the story, it's the author writes that it's joy that kills. And I wonder, I kind of want to leave you with that, is that what does it mean that joy kills? How can joy, something that represents happiness and excitement, enthusiasm, and life, almost directly, right? About we match up We synonymize, is that a word? We make synonymous life and joy. And then the text ends with heart disease, or you might read that, or joy that kills. Why would joy kill? How can joy kill? Why is this ironic, or why is this irony there in the story? To me, it almost seems as if Kate Chopin's voice might have been still stifled in this moment of writing the story. That she could still feel the pressures and know that if she had written, perhaps she had died of heart disease or the loss of her freedom as we read the story, that it would be too obvious, that it would be too harsh for the time and for the male audience to read. So instead, she creates a kind of subtle irony to represent her true idea as a kind of like covert. Well, anyway, that's just an idea I was just kind of having about this irony of joy that kills. It seems it's a paradox, right? It's a thing that on the surface seems to have no meaning, but underneath it has some good meaning. I would argue that maybe not. Maybe it's not even a paradox. It's just simply ironic and code language to articulate her point. Anyway, that's enough for now on Kate Chopin. Email me if you have any questions or critiques about this lecture, my very first ever recorded lecture.